So here we are for section 10, which is taking a look at television and specifically television's role in society. We're going to look at television really from two different perspectives. One that is more critical about television, and that television, as we've kind of heard all other media's sources being talked about, television as a media form is a method for those in power to control us. And the other perspective, which is a more positive perspective, is that there's something shared in watching television, and we can come together as a society and use television as a forum for discussion. So the first viewpoint, looking at television as a way for the media to control us, that's going to be brought to us from Herbert Schiller, who lived in 1919 to 2000. He taught at University of California, San Diego. And a lot of what he does relies heavily on the theory of hegemony. So, this critique of media as a way to control people. We've kind of thought about that before, and some of the past theorists that have talked about hegemony and dominant ideologies. He talks about this most notably in his book called The Mind Managers, which was published in the early 70s. So it wasn't necessarily later on in television's history. It was fairly early in television's history that he was making this critique. So his argument is that it's a basic kind of hegemonic argument. The media managers control images and information that shapes our beliefs and behaviors. Therefore, the dominant elites try to conform the masses so they can be more easily manipulated. And Schiller says we're given just enough hope in the American dream and that we can do anything we want to. The media keeps that dream alive in us, and that essentially keeps us content and hesitant to rebel. So, again, like Marx was saying, is that these institutions are opiate of the masses. Schiller's just taking that and expanding it out to television and saying, yes, it makes people content. It makes them passive rather than active participants in any kind of real meaningful change. So he comes up with these 5 myths that he talks about. And so I call these media myths or myths that keep us content. So myth number 1 is the myth of individualism and personal choice. And again, so he's talking about how the media, and in particular here television, how that creates a myth that we should value individualism. And so to talk about that, because on the face of it, individualism sounds very good. We're all kind of taught from a very early standpoint in our lives that we are unique, we are individuals, we have our own talents, and how special we are as individuals. What Schiller really is referring to with this myth is that historically, from an evolutionary standpoint, that's not really been a celebrated thing. That if you look at how society has evolved to the point where it is today, the Industrial Revolution happens very late in that history of mankind. And that until the Industrial Revolution, you really favored the group more so than you did the individual. If you think about tribal societies, which is how we all existed back in the day, those tribes worked where everyone may have had their own personal talents or the things they were good at, but they all served to enrich the tribe. Someone who was a good hunter was hunting for food that would keep the tribe alive. They weren't hunting just for themselves. The same with people who could tan skins and furs and things like that, so that there was clothing and there was shelter. Farmers, people who knew how to grow food, warriors who knew how to defend the tribe. Everyone had their own talent, but it was always for the benefit of the tribe first. And Schiller says, it's not till later on when the Industrial Revolution comes about and that people start gaining wealth. And that's what he says, is that individualism and privacy really was born from the gaining of material rewards and leisure time. So it was wealth and leisure time that really brought about individualism and privacy concerns. So what does he mean about that? He means that because we could stockpile money, because we could bank, because we could earn cash and save it, or because we had a really good product, could sell it at a very good at a very good profit. People started saying, "Well, this is mine. This money is mine, not yours. You can't have what I'm making, right? I'm not putting the money back into the tribe. I'm keeping it for myself." And because of that, people, the increase in private property increased, and people started, you started having a massive class warfare, so to speak, where you had the very, very rich, and then you had the workers and the poor. And individualism became more of a thing. Also, privacy arises because people who have lots of objects, material rewards, lots of money, they can afford to have leisure time. They don't have to work all the time. And they don't want other people interested in knowing how they're spending their money, or what they're spending their money on, or what they're doing with that time that's theirs. So we see these rights to privacy. You can't look at this because it's mine. That comes out of that. People begin valuing the individual over the group, and therefore what Schiller says is, if you look at television, it tends to do that too. Television is seen more as a deliverer of entertainment than it is knowledge. And Schiller makes the argument that that's because it favors an individual, not the tribe. It's not going to give the tribe, in other words society, information that says, here's how we all become better. It gives you entertainment, right? Because entertainment is more of a person-focused thing, right? Does this make you laugh? Does this make you sad or happy? How does it entertain you? Versus, turning on the TV and watching a class on, how to better manage your money. People want to watch the entertainment show more so than they do want to watch the show that gives knowledge. Okay. Again, these are Schiller's critiques. We can debate up and down all day about whether he's accurate or not, but these are the points that he's making. The second myth he comes up with is called the myth of neutrality. That basically the media is just totally neutral and shows the neutrality of other institutions. And Schiller says, in order for manipulation to be effective, evidence of its presence must be non-existent. Again, this is kind of a hallmark of hegemony, in that there are institutions that are doing everything they can to keep people in line and to keep the status quo and to protect the dominant ideology. Those institutions are out there, but the manipulation that they are enacting to get you to buy into it, that manipulation does not need to be seen. We don't need evidence of that. As soon as evidence of that active manipulation is being done, people start to lose faith in it, right? And the myth of neutrality is just saying that, television doesn't have conflicts of interest. Government doesn't have conflict of interest. The education system doesn't have conflict of interest. The promotion of science doesn't have a conflict of interest. All these major, even religion doesn't have conflict of interest. That television entertains best when it doesn't make you question all of your institutions. Okay. Again, Schiller says that it's best for entertainment and to show you that you don't need to question these things, right? You don't need to spend your time investigating these institutions and trying to point out how they are perhaps manipulating and misleading people. And so, naturally, whenever we do see something break down in those systems, when we do see that those systems aren't totally neutral, Schiller argues that what the media and television in particular tries to do is it tries to paint that problem as a personal problem rather than a problem with the system. In other words, we see a corrupt politician like Richard Nixon is thought to have been. And people just portray that off as he's a weak man. Same thing with Clinton and his problems with fidelity, marital fidelity, is that, well, he's just a weak person. He himself is the problem. He should do better. He lacks character. But what is not most often seen, that it really doesn't matter that much about, or not that it doesn't matter, but sometimes even people with strong characters can get into that position of power, and they become drunk with power. They start buying into the concept of the world's most powerful man. They start thinking that they can get away and do anything that they want. When we look at the media in and of itself, we say, well, Brian Williams obviously did some things in reporting that weren't good, and he got called out for it. Well, was it because he's a liar and because he's a weak person, or is it because we have this industry in journalism that tries to make reporters into celebrities so that people are constantly seeing them and hearing them? Is that what respected journalists are supposed to look like? Are they supposed to be celebrities? Schiller also has this myth of unchanging human nature, and that he thinks that the media and television kind of show people that, the world is what it is, and there's really no changing things. There's never going to be any kind of wide sweeping reform because things just operate the way that nature intends, right? And so a lot of people, to show an example of this rather, he says a lot of people will look at television and look at things like sex and violence and all that and just say, okay, well, that's just how the world works right now. That stuff's on TV. Yeah, that's just the way it is. There's nothing we can do about it. He says that this human expectation, when it gets low, passivity prevails. Well, what are you going to do? How are we going to fight this? There's nothing really we can do. And he applies it and he says, look, if you just see sex and violence on TV and just say, well, that's what TV does, you dismiss it, then that line gets pushed further and further and further, right? Oh, yeah, there's sex on TV. That's just the way it is. And then the sex gets worse on TV. The amount of blood and guts and violence gets worse. And people just say, that's the way TV's always been. It's always kind of pushed the envelope of what's appropriate. Schiller says that's not true. This mentality is not true. That one person can make a difference. That the media may tell you that they can't, that one person can't transform society, but Schiller says it happens all the time, and that if people do their part, big changes can occur, and that human nature can in fact change. The myth of the absence of social conflict, Schiller says that the media also manipulates people into believing that things aren't as bad as they really are. And he says that these mind managers convey there's no social conflict, there's nothing to pay attention to here. You don't want to get up and cause a revolution because nothing's the matter. We don't have issues of race, really. We don't have issues of gender, really. These are just blown up things that aren't as significant as you think. So, do we get any real investigation of that argument and how it is wrong? How race is still very much a factor in today's age. And Schiller says, no, we don't. We don't get that. We don't get someone really taking an honest look at racial relations or at gender discrimination. Why? Because an honest discussion would not draw as much attention as a polarized discussion where people are just screaming at one another. When you're screaming at one another, it just becomes an issue of conflict. Who's right and who's wrong? But it doesn't really look at these gray shades in between. For example, we know that Arabs and Jews do not get along. And they have not gotten along for a very long time. This has spilled over into land conflicts and disputes, into war. And we're constantly talking about who's the good guys, who's the bad guys, but we don't really step back and we say, okay, why are things so bad with that relationship? What started that? What made both of these groups think that they were right? And so Schiller says we avoid that more intense, deeper examination. We just want to know clear, clean-cut stories like we talked about. Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? How's this going to end? Because if we get into a deep discussion and really start digging around in a topic, the media fears that advertisers are going to run and the audience ratings are going to drop, and that hurts the money. Controversial issues will hurt the money. It'll hurt audience numbers and it'll hurt advertisers. So don't do it. And finally, the last criticism that Schiller has is called the myth of media pluralism. So what does he mean by that? He means that sometimes we are given this belief that there's so many choices out there that surely diversity does exist just because of the choices, the many choices that we have. And Schiller warns, do not confuse choice with diversity, right? So if I tell you, okay, well, tonight we're going to eat, but your choice is between McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, Sonic, okay? It seems like I'm giving you choice, and I am giving you choice. But am I really giving you a diverse option of food to choose from? All those places are burger and fry places, right? And that's what Schiller is saying, is just because you get, 250 channels in your cable subscription, that doesn't mean that you have 250 highly diverse sources of information, that there's a lot of repetition in choice that doesn't really equate to diversity, right? So they tell you, you can choose anything you want, you've got anything out there. But if you really sit down and start breaking down what you have, you'll see that you have 5 channels devoted to this topic, 5 channels devoted to that topic, 10 channels devoted to this topic, and you don't really have the diversity that you thought you did. And not only that, but then the programming starts to all look the same. How many shows or variations on a theme do we get whenever something gets popular, right? For a while there were nanny shows, right? Nanny 911, Super Nanny. These different shows. If you look at like Home and Garden TV, for a long time there was Flip This, Flip That. just shows about flipping houses, right? Taking houses and trying to sell them. And numbers of shows that followed that theme, right? But they're all kind of the same. So, yeah, there's a lot of choices out there, but you're not really sure if those choices are truly diverse. Now, let's look at an opposite argument, which is that television can provide something good. And this argument is going to come from a past professor of mine, Horace Newcomb, who was at the University of Georgia, wrote a well-known book called Television: The Critical View, which was it was basically TV criticism, but from an academic standpoint. It wasn't saying, is this show good, is this show bad? Rather, it was saying, here's what TV can provide. Here's what we can get. He also directed the Peabody Awards up until his retirement. The Peabody Awards, one of the most prestigious awards that you can win in broadcasting. TV news wins Peabodys. Comedy shows win Peabodys. Dramas win Peabodys. There are internet sites that have won Peabodys. Radio shows that have earned Peabodys. They're primarily directed towards broadcast and internet as opposed to print. But the running theme in all these things is that whatever is getting the award, it's doing so because it had something relevant to say about society. That it was an important show. Not just because a lot of people watched it, but because it had something important to say. And it did a good job of saying that. So, do you get like groundbreaking documentaries on social conflict and those types of stories, very highbrow topics? Yes, a Peabody can, a show like that can get a Peabody Award. But you can also get something like South Park that wins a Peabody, or The Daily Show that won a Peabody. So it's a gamut of things. And there's a host of judges. It's never just one person that says, yes, it needs a Peabody. It typically goes through students, and then professors, and then professional people. So it goes through, a host of judges before it finally gets down to the final selections. So you would imagine that someone who celebrates good television has things to say positively about the medium. And he says that television really is a cultural forum. That's his big tagline. And he's exploring this thought of perhaps sometimes we get so focused on finding the meaning of a particular show or a particular story that we forget multiple meanings are possible and people are getting different things out of this. So, yeah, is South Park a crude comedy? Yes. But could it also be highly investigative of society? Can it really tell us something about how our society works or doesn't work? Can it give us a message that tells us more about ourselves than just fart jokes and body humor and little kids cussing? Yeah, it can give us insight into ourselves and how we operate. And so he's asking about how do we engage television? How does television engage us? How does this operation work? How does this procedure work? And he draws back on an earlier scholar named James Carey, who really is the first one to talk about television and media as more of a ritual than a transportation process. So let me explain. In the early days of television, when we were concerned about its impact, we were always concerned about issues of transportation, right? What can television make you do? Because it has a message and it tries to transport that message to you. In other words, I'm talking about hypodermic needle theory, right? This television show has these certain values and it's trying to pass those values along to you. And what Carey says is that's a model of transportation. There is a message, and it goes from point A, which is the TV, to point B, which is the viewer. And Carey says that that's a very narrow view of how media and television work. That the media really is a source of communication, and that the media and television kind of follows those rules of communication. So is transportation a thing? Yes. If someone's getting up to speak publicly, they have a message that they are wanting to get across, right? And television most definitely does that too. It has a transportation, but communication also has a ritual aspect, and therefore television can have a ritual aspect. And what Carey introduces into this, into the studies, and makes people more aware of, is that people communicate and people engage with media maybe because they're not so much focused on the traveling of a message through space, but rather how society maintains itself throughout time. Communication can be a ritual in that it shows us our own shared beliefs, right? We connect because of communication. So is there a message that's being given back and forth? Yes, but there's also this ritual of coming together and exposing our connections through communication. James Carey's probably most famous quote that's used by other scholars is this quote here: communication is a symbolic process whereby reality is produced, maintained, repaired, transformed. And he's talking about that then as a ritual, right? If it was just a transportation model, it would be, well, communication is a process through which a message is delivered from A to B. That's not the quote. The quote is that it's a symbolic process where reality is produced, maintained, repaired, transformed. Let's look at those things and what he's saying. And we'll just say communication, and we'll define that as talking to each other. So talking to each other produces reality. Yes, that's true. That's a true statement. Is if I am telling somebody, well, we went to the baseball game the other day and we saw the most amazing baseball game. I've never seen anything like it. The pitcher threw a no-hitter. That person is telling you reality. Is telling you, here's what happened, here's what I see. I got my bill in the mail the other day, and it's just too high. It was too much. We're paying too much for our television subscription. Well, someone's telling you what the reality is, right? Communication can also be used as a process to maintain society. So you talk about the status quo and how you like something. I really like this show and what it's doing. I really like it when this pitcher plays for the baseball team. I really like it. I really like that show that I watch because it just seems so real. I can identify with it. And it shows me that things are okay and that my expectations about the world are okay. Communication can be used to repair things. So when something breaks down, we see a system is corrupt. Talking about that corruption can help us make things better. How do we fix something that's problematic? Well, let's sit around and discuss how we do that. And then transformed is you may sit around and say, you know what, the system can't really be fixed because it inherently lacks something. So let's transform society and reality, right? Let's make things totally different. We have that power, but we have to talk about it first. And so what Carey's really getting at is that there's this ritual act of communication that really needs to be seen more as a process rather than a product. A product is talking about communication as transportation, right? I have X message that I want to get to you. But this ritual aspect of communication is saying, communication back and forth is a process. It's much more nuanced. So Newcomb takes that and he just adapts this whole theory of ritual communication to address television. And so he says, well, look, television is communication. And therefore, any TV text can act as a forum or a ritual in which important cultural topics can be considered. So he's saying, look, television, even if you look at it and say, well, this is just entertainment. South Park is just entertainment. It's not trying to make society and reality better. It's just trying to get a laugh. And Newcomb would say, no, there are elements within this show that you can talk about, that have meaning. Indeed, if you look at a lot of South Park episodes, it is a cultural commentary on what people value, right? Or how society is just getting so out of whack. And Newcomb says, that's what South Park can do. It can be a show where people who view it get together and say, oh, what this show was really talking about was this aspect. And so it's bringing something up. And there's an episode of South Park that I was thinking about in which Cartman decides that he's going to have crack babies play basketball. And it ends up turning into this popular thing. And what really was going on there is that it was all a metaphor that South Park was using to say college athletes are basically treated like slaves. And we can investigate and talk about that a little more to clear that up, because I know that seems like a wide reach. But if you watch the episode, it becomes very clear that this just seemingly outrageous thing that's happening, turns out it is really a fair cultural critique, I think. Newcomb proposes a study of the flow of television. In other words, he also says, let's not get caught up in a single show. Let's watch large strips of television to determine which current social issues are important to Americans. And how are we struggling with those topics? Now, when Newcomb writes this piece on the Cultural Forum, it's early in his career, and the 24-hour news shows don't necessarily exist the way they do today. And so, if I turn on CNN, I can tell you what the current social issues that are important are today. But Newcomb was saying if you watch large strips of television, one show after the other, after the other, after the other, you would also start to pick up on what topics right now are hot topics. What do people want to talk about? What are people trying to figure out? And Newcomb suggests that audiences appear to make meaning from television by selecting that which touches experience and personal history. So he says, television has a deeper meaning for people and brings people together more so when people who are watching it identify with that television, right? And the way that you primarily identify with a show or with a character or anything like that is that something about that show or character is familiar to you in terms of your own personal experience and history. You see something that you recognize. You see something on television and you think, I went through that. That's similar to my situation. And that helps you identify more with that show or that character. Therefore, you want to talk more about it. You want to try to make meaning of it. Well, I was in a similar situation, but here's what happened. What's the difference? So it makes you investigate these things more so. And in the end, we have transportation of a message in which person A wants to get this message to person B. And traditionally, we would study and try to figure out, well, did person B get that message? Are they enacting what they heard? Are they putting that into practice in their own daily lives? What did the transportation of that message really do to the receiver? And Newcomb says, let's not worry about that so much as looking at, again, as television and the media, as ritual. And in ritual, you don't necessarily get a resolution. Ritual is about maintaining things, right? Transforming things. So ultimately what Newcomb is saying is that the raising of questions, the investigation of these social issues, that's, in the end, more important than the actual answering of them. An audience should be introduced to social issues regardless of whether there's a clear answer, right? So is journalism breaking down? Is it broken? Is it not functioning the way it should be? Yes. Do I have a clear answer as to how we fix that? How do we solve that tomorrow? No, I don't have a clear answer. But that doesn't mean we should not be discussing the situation and what needs to be done and what our best practices could be to solve that situation. And again, that just brings up what Newcomb is thinking based on what Carey was saying, is that communication, the media, television, whatever, it's a ritual that should be able to repair society or transform it if need be. So that's all I have to say for today. I thank you for your patience, and I will see you soon.